You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, starring myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there, we're putting all of these episodes for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. What about you?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited because tonight is just a fun episode. We're reviewing Deja Q, which is Star Trek Season 3, Episode 13. It debuted on February 5th, 1989. I had just turned 3 years old, so
Hmm.
I think that we had probably just started watching the show either this year or around now.
Right.
In world, we have a star date of 43539.1.
Yes.
So, before we get started, I have a lot of I I have a lot of fun questions I wanted to ask you because we have a little bit of a format, but this is such a fun kind of wacky
Well,
episode.
well, I have one thing I wanted to say. I was watching, it was on television tonight, the first
Yeah,
Chris Pine Star Trek that in that
right.
series. And there's the bar scene where the renegade, townie James T. Kirk gets into
Right.
fight with some Starfleet enlisted people, and Christopher Pike comes in and breaks them up. And we go back and forth about, well, what's the real mission of Starfleet and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
Captain Christopher Pike says the Starfleet is a peacekeeping and a humanitarian armada. And I
Oh
thought that was
yeah.
interesting because, okay, peacekeeping, good, humanitarian, but armada has a
Yeah.
militaristic ring to it. So,
So so if it let's get okay. So kind of stepping off the next generation and going into the alternate universe, which is known as the Kelvin universe that J.J. Abrams
oh
created.
yes, with
So
George Kirk,
um,
right?
yes. So I think the thing about the Kelvin universe is the understanding is everything in there is much more militaristic. Like they're already at war with the Klingons. They're basically at war with the Romulans.
Hmm.
It seems like the second film featured I forget what his Admiral Marcus. Um,
Yes,
it seems like Starfleet had already been in the middle of researching like not only starships but like warships
yes,
as well. So I think that those films are basically just set in a universe that have a take on Star Trek where the everything is just much more militaristic.
yes, yeah.
And even their society, one thing that I've always thought interesting about those films versus the original films and then the TNG films and of course the shows themselves. Um, the Christopher Pine films really do depict kind of like this future society where, you know, when you see them with their families and you see them out and about, a lot of them are still really kind of dressed in their military garb. A
Hmm.
lot of them are, it seems like a lot of people are in Starfleet. So
Hmm.
in the show, they kind of depict, well, Starfleet is just kind of this part, is kind of the, okay, let's say, the peacekeeping humanitarian organization within the Federation. It's not only the military, but it's diplomacy and science and exploration. It's all that.
Hmm.
Um, where was I going with this? I had something here. But it still seems like there's an outside economy, there's an outside world, there's an outside society that is not Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
And in the future, you don't actually have to be a Starfleet officer to be successful
Mm-hmm.
or to be someone of import or to even be famous or anything. You can actually live, it seems like, the the universe of the 24th century, at least if you're close to Earth, as DS9 puts it, you're basically able to live in paradise. And Starfleet is really a choice, much like
Mm-hmm.
joining the military today is much of a choice as joining the Peace Corps is a choice. There probably is some like career benefits, just like our real military or joining the Peace Corps or any government organization carries actual real world benefits. Um, but in the television shows and in the original films and in the TNG films, it never seems like Star Trek is this all. I mean, I'm sorry, Starfleet is this all encompassing thing. Where in the Abrams films or in the Kelvin universe, as fans like to call it, it very much is. It
Mm-hmm.
seems like Starfleet's just everywhere and kind of defines everything,
Interesting point.
like
Yeah.
culturally,
Right.
which I think says something about like. And before we continue into the episode, which is much more fun,
Mm-hmm.
um, one thing that they did in Star Trek Into Darkness, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan Noonien Singh, you know, in that universe, they still have a eugenics war and they still have World War III.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting to see that in the Kelvin universe, they become a more they still have a Starfleet and they still have a Federation and they still have all of these member planets and member species and worlds and things. But the outcome for humans has made us much more militaristic in the Kelvin universe. And I think a large part of that has to do with like maybe the writers of the Kelvin universe thought like, well, what's the realistic fallout to a World War III? How do we regiment ourselves or maybe
Mm-hmm.
reorganize ourselves in a way to prevent that from ever happening? Um,
Mm-hmm.
do you put stricter social discipline on society or do you let society be more carefree? I think that those are two. I think, that polarity there that I just mentioned.
Right.
Um, I think that's something that we've been debating, since the beginning of our civilization. So it's very interesting to see like how the different interpretations of Star Trek take place
Yes, it
with
is.
different writers'
Yeah.
views. And even I'm sorry to go on a bit of a rant here, but even the new shows, Discovery and Picard, and soon to be the Christopher Pike show, Strange New Worlds, those two have their own view of Star Trek that don't adhere necessarily to Gene Roddenberry's or Rick Berman or Brandon Braga's or Michael Pillar's visions. So
Mm-hmm.
the way people interpret this property and the way that you and I interpret this property is kind of like the show itself. Infinite diversity and infinite combinations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But sorry for everyone. Me taking that 7 minutes to kind of give you a little soliloquy on Star Trek, but let's get into Deja Q. So, Dad, I love this episode. Let's just dig in.
Sure. Go
Um,
ahead.
the Enterprise is at Braille for a planet that is threatened with massive destruction as the result of the decay of its asteroidal moon, which is slowly descending from its orbit. An impact will result in an ice age, tsunamis, and superseismic events. It is not exactly known why the moon's orbit has changed, but the Enterprise considers what they can do to change its trajectory or restore its orbit when Q, the quasi semi omnipotent being, appears naked on the bridge. It appears suddenly to the somewhat disgust and dismay of all that Q has lost his powers and is being punished by the Q continuum for his mistreatment of many species. Um, Q later relates that he is being punished for spreading chaos through the universe. So I've basically given away the entire story. Um, there is this asteroid moon that is descending upon Braille 4 that if they don't fix or they don't restore it to its original lunar trajectory, it will destroy everything. And of course, our favorite semi-omnipotent being played by John de Lancie is dropped in for his own adventure. Dad, how do you feel about this episode? In many ways, I think it's a short, tight episode, as a lot of the season 3 episodes kind of feel, but I think that there's a lot of fun with this one, and it really is. Even the asteroidal moon storyline is very much secondary to Q.
Yeah, I think it's just a very, again, tight and really one of the funnest episodes. And it since it has the challenge that the Enterprise has is to trying to solve these problems for the people on Braille for of the havoc that their moon being out of its proper orbit, trying to fix that problem. It ties up at the end very
Mm-hmm.
when Q does get his powers back. We can talk about that, but there's just a lot of fun scenes in this from um, Q actually experiencing himself as a human, like my stomach. I'm hungry and ordering 10 ice chocolate sundaes, and
Mm-hmm.
there's always the tension between Guinan and Q, where they just
Right.
detest one another and don't trust one another and so forth. Since Guinan is a being that has a lot more of experience than humans do with the Q, and particularly with this Q. So it's just got a lot of fun stuff in it.
Absolutely. I think some unique world building that we can expand upon from some of our earlier discussions in season 1 when Q's first kind of
Hmm.
introduced. Um one thing that I find interesting in mythology are trickster characters. And we mentioned in season 1 how Q very much fits that into that mold of a trickster character in a way. Um just for a little bit of a side note and a review to what these trickster characters are, a lot of people view them as these dark characters that have these mischievous ends and often villainous means. But in world mythology, trickster characters are often there to take protagonists or heroic characters and through trickery actually teach them needed lessons to progress a hero or a protagonist along their needed quest.
So are they a
Um,
little bit like the role that fools play, like in Shakespearean
Very
plays?
much so, yes. So out of their misfortune, fortune springs.
Hmm.
So in many ways, that's how you can look at a trickster. I think Q fits this very well, but when Q was first introduced in season 1 at the Encounter of Farpoint, he introduces himself as this kind of omnipotent judge who is here to take stock of humanity and render sentence upon us.
Hmm.
So, the original line from that episode is that the trial never ends.
Mm.
Um, it's made very clear in the very first few moments of the storyline that first Q is not omnipotent because he is able to be stripped of his powers. Um, he is not alone because the continuum is, at least of a body that is able to separate him as an individual from their joined consciousness or realm of existence, dimension, whatever you would call it. Are you still watching Voyager?
Yes.
Have you gotten to the episode where they actually go to the continuum? I
Um,
think it's season 2, maybe season
yeah,
3.
there was an episode in Voyager where he showed up. I can't remember what he did in it right now.
Is that the one where there's the other Q that wants to take his own life?
Yes, that was the one. Yeah,
So they go to the continuum there.
right.
And,
That's right.
so
That's right.
we're going to somewhat talk about that episode a little bit as a reference to this one
Right.
because I
Sure.
think it's
Go ahead.
important. So, for those of you at home who have not, uh, who do not know what Jake and I are referring to, there's a Star Trek Voyager episode where Q appears in both the form of John de Lancie and the form of, I think his name is, the Renegade Q goes by the name of Quinn, and they appear in the episode, I think it's called, yes, it's the episode Death Witch, which is Star Trek Voyager Season
Mm-hmm.
2, Episode 18.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we get that referenced.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's very clear from that episode in Voyager that the continuum is an actual place of being that can actually be physically traveled to by the crew members of Voyager, um, through the initiatory experience, or teleportation by a member of the Q continuum. This episode of TNG actually sets that up for the first time, the idea that there are separate Qs, and that the Q continuum itself is not just like this entity or consciousness, but kind of a congress of people. Um, in many ways, this is the first episode that sets up the idea that maybe there is a Q pantheon.
Well, that's an interesting word to use because in a previous
Right.
episode we talked about whether Q is God or whether they're gods, and I think what we're coming
Well,
to right here is they really aren't. That
no, not at all.
they're a higher level of being, transdimensionally or however they
Hmm.
exist, but they are not
Well,
they are not gods.
Well, can may I review for the listeners one more time? I think the three things that make up a legitimate god.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is you need to have the ability to create or destroy. So that's omnipotence.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing that you need is the ability to know all things at once, past, present, or future. That's omniscience. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the third and most important one of all, and I think this is the real one that we're going to debate when it comes to Q, is omnipresence. Not the
Mm-hmm.
ability to not just know and not the ability to just create or destroy, but to exist in all things and to not exist in all things at the same time. Like there's no beginning for you and there's no end. You simply be.
It
And
is it is it is the primary and most important definition of the verb to be in whatever language.
yes. Well, like this is the Judeo-Christian version of logos. This is the idea that Plato had, of what a probably godlike entity was.
I am that
Um,
I am.
exactly. This is Jehovah. This is Allah. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, one of the key components, I think, of Judeo-Christianity's dominance in world religions, and maybe Buddhism too, to a certain extent, and I think elements of Hinduism, is that many of those gods feature um, omnipresence as a key detail of their divinity.
Mm-hmm.
Where in past pagan religions, like Thor is either on Earth here in Midgard, questing about, or he's up in his hall in Bilskirnir in Asgard. Odin is either wandering around the universe or he's in Valhalla. And the way that Odin gets his information, or his omniscience, or his omnipresence, is through his ravens, Muna and Hugin, that come to him every morning and every night and whisper to him the news of the universe.
Mm.
So, like, pagans had a very limited view of what their gods can do. So the Judeo Christian ones were actually interesting because they were the first ones that kind of have this kind of all encompassing definition. But you also saw that in Zoroastrianism, you saw it in elements of like ancient um, Egypt cults. I mean, the Babylonians, the Assyrians also had the idea of a kind of a macro or arch supreme being over all things. Even the Greeks, through the Titans had
Mm-hmm.
an originating source. So,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, there's also Taoism that believes that we all originate from the Tao. But the point that I'm trying to get here is that it's very clear that. Um, Even though they're omnipotent, even though they have some sense of omniscience, they are not the Q are not omnipresent. They can't be all places at once, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there, is just our key definite is just our key moment here where we can fundamentally say Q is not a god.
Hmm.
Do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, no, I think that description that you just, or what you just explained, and that kind of answers that question that we batted about in the past episodes. Yes.
Well, one thing that is interesting is the actor who plays Q, John de Lancie. A lot of people don't know that John de Lancie is a devoted skeptic and secularist. He actually makes a lot of atheist arguments. Has actually been invited to a lot of atheist political rallies to speak on
Hmm.
his beliefs
Hmm.
towards rationality, and he has actually often used Q as an example to um, explain why he thinks there is no great supreme being in the universe. He's like, if the great thing that Star Trek did was take characters like the Judeo-Christian God and personify them in Q, in his view, and thoroughly break them down to what they were,
Hmm.
just other
Hmm.
imperfect beings.
Hmm.
Um, one thing that Q shows up in, he shows up naked and he shows up without clothes. And one of the things that he says when he is taken to the brig by Worf is that clothes are kind of like, he might be bound in this life where he has to worry about being hungry and being cold and losing his hair and getting old, and um he says, have to worry about covering his skin in cloth for this outdated human notion of morality. um what do you think of the idea of clothing being a moral or ethical thing that we're choosing to do, and why would you think Q would find it outdated? Because
At that, yeah,
even though
right.
he's not omnipresent, he is omniscient. So he does have a sense of like what humans do in the future.
Well, it's a really good question because if you think about it, if you go back 100,000 years or 50,000 years, and our ancestors were still in the Horn of Africa, the climate may have been such that they would go around naked. And
Hmm.
nakedness was not a moral issue at all. And then perhaps as they moved into, up into the Arabian Peninsula, into Asia, into Europe, where the climate was cooler, those big brains that Homo sapiens were developing realized, well, it's cold. We got to do something. And they were, killing animals for food. And they were smart enough to do something with the skin. So somebody came up with the idea of clothing.
Hmm.
So, as protection from, weather and rain. I mean, they would probably have some waterproof hides even when they were in rain. So clothing was at first probably a utilitarian exercise.
Hmm.
And then once that was accepted and so forth, then somehow, you know, morality came into it where you could not expose your body to someone else unless it was your spouse or something like that. So it really brings up a good point about it's like, all right, how many nudist colonies are around the world and nudist
Right.
beaches and so forth, and like, what the hell? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, when you come into the world, you're naked. No one gets
I think
upset about babies being naked. They don't put them in clothes right away. They put them in a diaper.
I think clothing is one of those interesting things where, like you said, it's probably started out as a key part of serving a function of survival, and
Hmm.
then took on these cultural aspects of fashion and
Hmm.
symbolism and all these other things.
Class status and so forth,
Yeah,
wealth, indicators of wealth.
exactly. I think one thing that, I find interesting in Star Trek is the clothing choices they make really do away with kind of that materialistic, people have fashion and people have designs and stuff like that, but like there isn't anything openly materialistic about the designs, and they're very streamlined. But
I thought,
even then,
yeah.
like Q still finds those like kind of repugnant in terms of moral restrictions. If in the future we have this more kind of streamlined, more modular clothing, I guess that I'm trying to, or ergonomic clothing, as I'm trying to describe. What is the point where we get to a place, maybe, and I don't know, we've talked about CRISPR in the past. What if we get to the point where we don't need clothing because we don't have to worry about cold or hot, or like we can just go without it because we already have perfected some sort of skin, or we've changed our epidermis to be completely adaptable to the environment that we're in.
Well, the social and moral role that clothing currently have would have to change. And,
Right.
the one thing I've always thought about Star Trek, even back to the original series, is that in general, the uniforms, and, they are uniforms, but they've been,
Hmm.
for the most part, they've been very utilitarian and simple.
Hmm.
I mean, you
Very
think about
true.
it, when you see, people go into space, and people on the International Space Station, the clothes they wear, are very simple clothes, you know.
Well, I
Um,
think we're slowly actually moving towards that, and like, so I know you're probably not up in terms of the cool kids fashion, but
no.
so the big thing people are into now is, and they have been for like the last 10 to 15 years, is this kind of version of fashion called streetwear. And it's kind of like what you're talking about. It's kind of like streamlined things, like, matching sweats, matching uniforms, matching like athletic suits, stuff like that. Stuff that you would just, wear out on the streets. Very casual clothing, but not, anything too revealing or anything too out there. Um, I think in some ways, like, we are moving towards that streamlined version of clothes anyway. Um, but I'm sorry, you were about to say
No,
something.
one thing I hope happens is that I think the idea of, and this would have to be kind of redesigned, men's suits and so forth, but we don't need to have ties. Ties are stupid.
No. Oh no, ties are really dumb. I am still surprised that we have not done away with the belt. Like, to me, the belt seems to be something that becomes less and less commonplace.
Well,
Even among like the professional class.
so how do you secure your pants? You use suspenders, or you just have elastic in the waistband?
I like the Jonathan Archer jumpsuit. I think that we should just go ahead and jump to the Jonathan
I
Archer
like.
jumpsuit.
Oh yes, I like. Yes,
So,
absolutely,
like,
absolutely.
to me, that is the best Star Trek
Well, it's
uniform.
it's basically a flight suit. What it is,
Yeah, exactly.
it's like Air Force or Navy pilots. Yeah,
Yeah, I think we'd all feel fine in a flight suit.
sure, sure.
Yeah. Um. So this is already
Somebody
a
might
fun
say, "Well,
episode.
it's hard to take a crap when you're in a jumpsuit, though."
Yeah. Oh, that's well. Do you know what? Our toilet habits are changing too. So anyway, so once they take Q to the brig, um, they realize that they have the conundrum of like, what do we do with this no longer omnipotent being who somehow still retains, as Q will later reveal, an IQ of 2005? You can't just leave him out in the world because he's basically helpless. He has no idea how to fend for himself as an actual mortal human being, which apparently he had a choice in. Um,
Mhm.
but on the other hand, like, he also has come to the Enterprise seeking asylum. He has this kind of wonderful line where he says, "Jean Luc, you're my only friend." you know, I I think the great part about this episode is all of the reactions Patrick Stewart gets to create being annoyed at John de Lancie's
Yes,
character.
yes, yes.
Um, But I think on one hand, when you have a being like this, what do you do with them? Especially if you have someone that has the innate IQ of a Q being. Um, I think the solution that they come up with by trying to integrate him into the crew function and assigning him to Data as his quote unquote professor of the humanities is
Mm-hmm.
actually really smart, and it's trying
Mm-hmm.
to I guess assimilate him as quickly as possible. Because one thing that I really do commend the writers, and I actually commend I, I commend the storytelling on, despite them disliking and almost flat out hating Q, like Guinan hates Q, Worf hates Q. Despite all that, they treat him with a sense of dignity and respect and try to take care of him almost intrinsically without even thinking about it, even though they dislike this character greatly. I think it says something about, maybe the view of the future that we have, that even though we have to deal with these kind of assholes, we've progressed to the point where our better angels really are just kind of our natural way of being. Um, do you have anything that you want to reflect in terms of how the crew
Yeah,
reacts to
yeah. I
Q
just think
and just the general?
I think it's interesting that Q is paired up with Data
Hmm.
because Data has his own, challenge and struggles to define his own humanity, understand his own humanity,
Right.
and as we've discussed, Data really is very human in many ways. So that's an
Yes.
interesting interplay where you have an android who's trying to understand his humanity, teach somebody about what it is to be human.
May I also make a note? Data does actually. So throughout the show, Data is trying to develop emotional content and the ability to register emotional feelings.
Right.
Um, and one of the key things that he says in this episode early on is that, he finds it very ironic that the thing that he's been trying to be all of his existence, Q has just basically stumbled upon as a means of punishment.
Mm-hmm.
First, great line. Whoever wrote that
Mm-hmm.
line deserves a lot of credit.
Mm-hmm.
But the second thing, Data has a sense of irony, and it made me wonder: is iron does irony, can one be objective and have a sense of irony, or does one have to have a certain sense of subjectivity, which I think requires a certain sense of emotion, for Data to basically go like, "Huh, isn't this something?"
Yeah, and I think there's been some other episodes where Data learns something new and he goes, which is very, very human response to learning something new. So yeah, I think that what you say, if Data sees the irony of the situation that Q is in, yeah, you put it very well. That there has to be this subjective view of, boy, isn't this something where this guy's ended up?
Right. Well,
Yes.
as you also mentioned, Data is a great character to juxtapose with this kind of depowered Q character, because on one hand, you have someone that has had omnipotence, who has had omnipresence, but he is suddenly stripped and feeble without all of that. And then you have this character who has been wanting humanity, which, this main character that I just described thinks is a weakness, but is now in a position where I think we forget that Data is an android sometimes. We just talked
Hmm.
about how, he's human, but he has super strength, super speed. He can compute trillions of permutations a second. He is basically a walking incarnation of a physical god in many senses. Like, we've seen him do amazing stuff that people just can't
Hmm.
do.
Hmm.
Um, I think that writing wise, it's just a very cool pairing that
Hmm.
this episode is put together, and very effective in that sense.
Hmm.
Um, So I have to ask you a very important question, Dad. A very important question. You've just been thrown out of the continuum. You're starving. What are you ordering 10 of when you get to 10 forward?
Oh, he's gonna he's
Like, he orders chocolate sundaes. What are you ordering?
what would I order?
Yeah.
Well, you have to just look at the scene because Q goes in and he's depressed about his state, and he asks Data, well, what should I order? And Data says, well, there's a variety of things, all these different cuisines. And when Q says depressed, Data says
Dr. Counselor Troy is
when
sad.
Counselor Troy says she just wants something chocolate, and what's that? And he says chocolate sundaes. So he says, fine, I'll have chocolate sundaes, and orders 10 chocolate sundaes. I When you asked me that question, what popped into my mind, the first thing that I would order would be pizza.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good choice.
Yeah.
Um, I had a hard one with this. I actually thought tacos first for some
Mm,
reason. Like,
mm,
I would want like 12 tacos for some
mhm,
reason, like a
mhm,
variety of tacos, but pizza's
mhm,
a good one. What
mhm.
would you have on your pizza?
Um, Pepperoni, mushrooms, anchovies, and onions.
That's awesome. Um, so, you know, one thing that happens in this episode, I mean, in this scene where Data and Q are in 10 forward, um, the proprietress or the manager, Gaiden, shows up, and as we know, Gaiden's an Aryan who later on in Star Trek Generations will be revealed to have been part of this community that existed in this kind of temporal ribbon that's ripping through the universe called the Nexus.
Mm,
She was actually rescued by James T. Kirk, who was ripped into the Nexus, and the crew of the Enterprise B at the beginning of Star Trek Generations. She is basically very long lived and has a very mysterious but deep seated relationship with Captain Jean Luc Picard, and is played by the immensely talented and one of the best actresses I think in the world, Whoopi Goldberg. Um, she it should also be mentioned that Guidance people, the Arns, at one point, I think before the Nexus, had a run in with the Borg and basically
yes,
had their civilization destroyed.
yes, correct.
But it's basically assumed that like these Arns have some sort of power and that they have some sort of range of perception outside of the typical human
Right,
or the
yes.
typical mortal creature. And Q actually refers to Guinan as a creature many
Mm-hmm,
times in many
mm-hmm,
episodes, which
mm-hmm,
sometimes means to me that Guinan's form as we see her as Whoopi Goldberg may not actually be her final form.
mm-hmm,
Um, One thing that she does in this episode really well is that Guinan, points out that Q is going to have to rely on the charity of others, but she also tests out his mortality by stabbing him in the hand.
mm-hmm.
Um, First of all, a very powerful scene, and I think one of the better ones for John de Lancie in this episode. I think this is really the only Guinan scene in the episode that I could think of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you think of um, the idea of we often tell people that we don't like that you're going to have to live off the charity of others in a 24th century um, universe where you know capitalism has ended and the search for materialistic wealth and desire has ceased. um, isn't everyone kind of living off charity?
Well, that's a good point, but it's that people are allowed to find the best way that they can express themselves and contribute to society. So one of the things that happens is that Q, asks. Jean Luc to, give me something to do on board. They ends up going
Hmm.
to help Geordi with try to solve the problem of how to return the moon to its proper orbit. That's where he, makes some interesting suggestions in the episode as to how they can fix things, how they can
Hmm.
extend the warp field to move the moon and so forth.
Well,
Uh,
the first one was changing the the gravitational constant of the
Constant of the
universe.
universe, right?
Yeah, which
Yeah.
I actually have to say, if we could take a sidestep for a second, I found very interesting. Um, because despite them not being gods, they have a sense of, we have God, I just want to make sure it's late. I don't want to uh so we know that there are four fundamental forces at work in the universe: the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and the gravitational force. The fact that Q, as a creature or as a being, can say, "Oh, you just have to change the gravitational constant of the universe to change the moon's density so you can move it."
Mm-hmm.
Even if they aren't gods, and they are just advanced kind of humanoid beings or beings that ascended to a different plane of consciousness. The fact that they have kind of this base information that is possible says at some point that, like, some civilization, and maybe it might be us one day, has the ability to unlock the four forces of the universe. You know, we talk a lot about nuclear power, and we talk a lot about AI, but I think it gets back to the Arthur C. Clarke quote. At some point, a technology gets so advanced that it just seems like magic.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was either Clark or Heinlein that said that. I think it's Clark. Um, but I think the thing that I'm always fascinated about in terms of this solution of changing the gravitational constant of the universe, and it really didn't hit me until the third viewing of this. Um, Even though Q is a trickster, and even though the Continuum has these kind of outlandish characters that try to take their own lives and bring chaos to the universe, they could do so much worse if they wanted to, because they have an understanding of the universe far beyond us. The fact that they don't, I think, speaks to a certain level of either responsibility,
Mm-hmm. Right.
or you get to a certain point of existence or maybe consciousness where the idea of maybe exerting power that way isn't there for you. Like, why exert power when you don't have to? Do you have any reflections
Yeah,
on
I
that?
mean that's a the comment. Just thinking about that, it may perhaps first of all, I think that we can, as time goes on, we will make breakthroughs in understanding how the physics and the physicality of the universe works. I mean, just think that 100 years ago, um, there started to be the concept of nuclear fission,
Right.
and then the atomic bomb and nuclear energy, and now fusion we're looking at. So I think there will be advances. I think that the further we advance in science, whether it's physics, biology, chemistry, we're getting into the nanostructures, which is more challenging. But at the same time, we're developing, better tools, better telescopes, better uh, cyclotrons, things like that, CERNs, that sort of things to break down, uh, matter into its quantum particles. Yeah, in some ways, it's more challenging to make these uh, advances. But the other thing that came to mind was
Oh,
when you
pardon
talk
me.
about responsibility, with this knowledge comes responsibility. it's sort of like what's happening, the struggle we have as a species to deal with climate change.
Right.
That, um, we have to accept as a species responsibility for changing our environment and, what the impact that on that environment, of those changes will be. So it's like the human species has had the power, developed the power to make these changes, but they have to accept responsibility for what the results of what we've done are.
Right. Very well put. So, in dealing with this descending asteroidal moon, Geordie LaForge ingeniously, uh, I guess, deciphers and comes up with the idea based off Q's idea of changing the gravitational constant of the universe, of actually changing the mass of the asteroidal moon itself using the Enterprise's deflector dish to basically kind of beam energy into it and change its gravitational field.
Hmm.
Um, this is interrupted by the appearance of the Cal Calma, Calmarine. Yeah, the
Cal-
Calmarine who are old. Sorry, go ahead.
I pronounce it the calamarain, I think is how they say it.
Yeah, I think
Right.
you're right. The Calamarain. The
Yeah.
Calamarain who have had run-ins with Q before, and are there to collect their vengeance upon him.
Yes.
In a very dramatic scene, Data actually saves Q from an attempted abduction by the Calamarain, and Q, for the first time in touch with death, considers an attempted suicide and absconds with the shuttle, and does this both to end what he thinks is a miserable life as a mortal being, but also eliminate the danger of that the Calmarine posed to the Enterprise's mission.
Hmm.
Um, because of this, another Q, played by Corbin Burnson,
Right.
appears and informs our recently thrown out Q that his act of selflessness has endeared him back into the continuum, and that he will be given his powers. So we're coming to the end of the episode, and Q returns in this kind of joyous explosion of a mariachi band. Uh,
Oh, I
Honestly,
love it.
one of
It's so
the
funny. It's
funnier
so
scenes.
funny. Right.
So, fun fact about the scene: this was actually a very hard one to produce, and they couldn't get John de Lancie and the track of the trumpet to line up correctly. So John de Lancie actually had to learn to play it. So when
Hmm.
he's dancing like that, he's actually doing a little bit of that playing. They've gone back in post and of course dubbed over a little bit, but like
Hmm.
apparently it was a very long and arduous shoot, and so was the one where he actually had to appear naked at the beginning of the because that was the only way that it seemed to work. Um, just a great scene, and I wanted to follow up with uh, some questions. So, you were a Q who has recently been brought back into the favor of the Continuum, and you were given powers. What cigars are you passing out on the deck of the Enterprise D to everyone?
Cubans.
Cubans?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought Cubans. I thought I would give everyone a nice Perdomo, maybe.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I found it interesting that Q made the little snipe about Riker not being interested in women like he used to be. Um,
Oh, I like the line he said to Riker. He said, "You're so stolid. You were never like this before the beard."
right. Um, I think that it's very interesting. First of all, wonderful scene, and I think a very sweet one where Q is, very much taken off the villain shelf for the rest of the the series and for the rest of the franchise. I think if he appears again, I don't think we ever see him as a villain after this episode.
Well, plus he redeems himself after he,
Correct.
Corbin Burnson shows up, which I thought I like Corbin Burnson as an actor, and he's was so sprightly. He was like reminded me as
Hmm.
a leprechaun when he shows up, And then
Right.
Q gets his powers back, and he takes the calamari and said, "I'm going to give it to you now." And the other Q comes and says, and he said, "Okay,
Right.
I got it." And then, of course, Q really redeems himself by putting the planet back into its proper orbit, and the the people on Braille 4 call the Enterprise and can thank and congratulate Picard for fixing
A
everything,
great
and they
scene.
said, "Okay, yeah, I'm glad everything's good." You know,
Well, Picard Picard is so frustrated. I love how they give Patrick Stewart this line where he's like, "Huh?" Like
right?
he had they just give this moment where Picard looks at the screen when they say like you restored the moon. He goes, "Huh?" And he's like, "Thank you," and then everything just disappears.
Hmm.
I think just in general, and we're kind of at the end of the episode.
Hmm.
Um, I think in general, this has just been a really wonderful, fun episode. There's not really much to talk about in this.
No, I
It's
think
just
it's. I,
great.
I I think we've talked about some good things. I think it's one of the most fun episodes so far in the 3 seasons. Really.
When I do think of season 3, I do think of this episode a lot.
Hmm.
Just because there's so many great visuals of especially Q with the mariachi band. That is such an iconic
It
scene
is.
that like it's one that you can't separate from the next generation, I think.
Hmm.
Um
Hmm.
Dad, before we go, do you have any departing thoughts about Deja Q?
No, just as we said, just a fun episode. It well put
Absolutely.
together. Yes.
Yes. Well, thankfully this was a fun episode. The next episode that we will be talking about will be much more difficult, but we will be back for a matter of perspective, which is
Hmm.
Star Trek Next Generation season 3, episode 14, and we will see everyone then. Dad, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I
Thanks,
hope you had a
Jay.
great time.
I did. Bye now.
Bye.